Okay, thanks. Thanks very much, Christine, and thanks everybody for staying on to listen to this brief introduction to this new guidance that will be coming out next year on the conduct of evaluations of policies and programs and so on, the kinds of things Richard was talking about, but using natural experimental methods. Now, the guidance is going to be published next year. It clearly, therefore, doesn't exist at the moment. So what I'm going to be telling you is about the approach that we're taking to developing the guidance and the main messages that we think we will be putting out through this new guidance. So I'll tell you a bit about the origins of the guidance, where it comes from, then a bit about the methods we're using to develop it, what the guidance will contain, and then I'll say something about a couple of different parts of the guidance, and throughout I'll be concentrating on the kind of headline messages rather than the detailed nuts and bolts of how you conduct an actual experimental evaluation and use the opportunities available to derive causal estimates of the effects of different policies and programs. So it's completely non-technical, it's at quite a high level, but I'd be very glad to get your feedback on whether the kinds of things we're saying and the kinds of things we're covering are relevant to the kinds of work that you people in the audience are doing or might do in the future. So a little bit on the existing guidance, and then most of my talk will be about what we're going to cover in the new guidance that will be out next year. So yeah, so I was involved about 10 years ago in developing some guidance for the Medical Research Council on how to use natural experiments to evaluate population health interventions. And there's a series of messages in that guidance, which I think are still fairly current, but which we now, I think, need to expand given the experience of the last 10 years. So what did we say in 2012? Well, we started with a definition of a natural experiment, and we really define natural experimental evaluations in contradistinction, if you like, to planned experiments like randomized controlled trials. And what we said was that in a natural experiment, unlike in a planned experiment like a trial, the assignment, whether or not units are exposed or not, is determined by the way the policy or the program is implemented, rather than by the research of manipulating exposure in order to conduct the experiment. And unlike a trial, where you would normally use some process of randomization, it could be at individual or cluster level. Unlike that kind of process in a natural experiment, these processes are very rarely random or even as if random, close to random. Usually there's a strong element of selection. In other words, some individuals or groups or other kinds of units like villages or hospitals or towns, some of these units are selected to receive the intervention on the basis of some characteristic like income, age, geography. And those characteristics are very often associated with outcomes, just as the intervention is associated with outcomes. And that means we have a big problem with confounding, and understanding and taking account of this selection process is what's key to designing a natural experimental study well, to give you a strong basis for making causal inferences about the effects of the intervention. And the big problem with designing a natural experiment study is that, unlike in a trial where, randomization is the kind of answer to the problem of selection, whatever kind of trial you're doing, in a natural experiment, there's no single universally applicable solution to this problem of selection. Instead, what we've got is a range of partial solutions, each of which will work well in some kinds of circumstances, but not necessarily in others. So we have a range of sort of inference problems to solve, if you like, or inference problems to solve, and you have a range of methods. And the key to designing a good study is matching the two up. So using the strongest method given the precise details or precise circumstances of your case. So those are the main messages of the earlier guidance published 10 years ago. I would still, by and large, stand by these messages, but things have moved on. The guidance has been reasonably, useful. I think it's been widely cited. We published it at a time when interest in natural experiments was growing generally, as this study from the epidemiology literature shows. The axis is a bit small, but in the early 2000s, the numbers of studies using actually experimental methods that were being published in the epidemiology literature was beginning to grow quite rapidly, and our guidance was published partway through that process, and I think to some extent has benefited from this growing interest, but I think possibly also has helped to stimulate this further interest. And as time's gone on, other people have produced overviews like our one. There's several of these now available in the literature, but we still think it's timely to revisit the guidance and update it for several reasons. One is that some of the basic ideas are still debated. There's no general consensus about the basic definition even of a natural experiment, so a bit more clarity there about what hinges on the use of different definitions might be useful. What our guidance did, and what most other kinds of guidance focused on, is really the methods you use for effect estimation, and some new methods have emerged since we were writing, or it might have emerged slightly earlier, but have become more widely used since we were writing. We'd like to draw attention to these synthetic control methods in particular, very widely used now, very rarely used at the time that we were initially writing. So there's these new methods that we want to draw attention to. But I think more importantly, really, there's been a whole series of other developments in design and conduct of research which are relevant to natural experimental evaluation, which we didn't cover in the earlier guidance, but we want to cover in the new guidance. Developments in particular that have been prompted by what's known as a replication crisis, the fact that a lot of studies provide results that turn out not to be reliable. There are ways in which this kind of tendency can be countered, through the use of open science methods in particular, and we want to incorporate some of that into the new guidance as well. So we think basically that there's plenty to say in the update of the guidance. We're lucky enough to get Medical Research Council and NHR to agree that this would be useful. So what we're now doing is putting this new guidance together. So what we're aiming to do is to provide a kind of single, integrated and up-to-date guide to the conduct of and use of natural experiments, which hopefully covers a wider range of approaches than the previous guidance did. We want to raise awareness in the research community about the range of methods that you can use if you want to do a natural experimental study. But we're not just speaking to researchers. We also want to provide informational guidance that will help decision makers in government departments decide whether a natural experimental evaluation would be the way to go with an evaluation of the policies or programs that they're developing. And we want to help other people involved in the research process, like journal editors and funders and peer reviewers, give them some help with assessing the strengths and weaknesses of the papers they see reporting natural experimental studies, or evaluating research proposals that come to their funding stream. So we want to speak to researchers, but also to these other audiences as well. And the methods we're using are fairly similar to the methods used for other forms of guidance. We've got a writing group together. I'll give you the names at the end. We've got an advisory group, which includes some other researchers, not just based in the UK, but internationally, and also evidence users, if you like, or potential evidence users from government departments and the health service. And we've got a funders oversight group keeping us on track and on time. We did 3 workshops this summer. Now that workshops tend to be online, we were able to do these internationally. Had we been limited, had we done a face-to-face workshop in the traditional way, we'd have just got UK people together with possibly 1 or 2 people from overseas, but we could run these international workshops quite cheaply. So we did them globally. We had one in the Americas, one in Australasia, one in Europe. So we've got quite a wide range of input from researchers around the world. And we're just finishing an online consultation exercise about the main proposals that we're going to make in the guidance. So we're developing the guidance collaboratively with people in the research community and users of research evidence. And that input's been extremely valuable. And I'd be very interested to get your perceptions as well via questions after I finish speaking. So that's how we're developing the guidance. What we want to cover, like the previous guidance, we will be talking about methods, but we also want to bring some clarity to the concept and definition of a natural experiment, say something about how you should go about designing and planning natural experimental studies. And we also want to say something about the really the infrastructure and governance requirements for doing natural experiments well. This is one of the things that has really changed over the past 10 years. We've got much better research infrastructure, data infrastructure now than we had back then. And then we want to put out some good practice considerations focused on these different audiences that I've mentioned. So I won't be saying much about the methods or really anything about the methods in the time I've got left, but I will say something about concepts and definitions, say what we think is the right approach to design and planning, and then just briefly draw your attention to some of these good practice considerations. So in terms of definitions, well, we want to go with the same broad definition of a natural experiment as we used in the earlier guidance. A natural experiment is any event or any process of assignment outside the control of a researcher or research team that divides a population into exposed and unexposed subpopulations, and so that we can compare outcomes in these two populations to get an estimate of the effects of the intervention. And a natural experimental evaluation then uses this process to evaluate the impacts of the intervention on some outcome or range of outcomes. So all very straightforward, but not everybody in the natural experiments field thinks the same way. Some people want to define natural experimental studies in terms of a prescribed range of methods that might be used for this job of causal inference. And some people think you can only really talk about a natural experiment if the assignment process is close to being random, and it's as if random. It might not be explicitly random, but it has to pretty well work like a random process. We are skeptical about these efforts to narrow down the definition. One of the whole purpose, if you like, of bringing natural experiments into the toolkit of evaluation methods is to broaden the range of policies and interventions and programs that you can usefully evaluate. So restricting the definition is not really in the spirit of that ambition. Some people think that, as I've said, that you can only really talk about natural experimental study if you're using a prescribed range of methods, and there's been several lists of these kinds of methods produced. They have very little in common, so that method, kind of falls on the grounds of consistency. New methods are coming along all the time. Deciding which methods are good and which methods are bad just on the basis of broad study labels is not particularly good. You need to know how they apply in the precise circumstances of a given case. So we don't like the list of methods approach. The as if randomization criterion, again, we think that's overly restrictive, and generally it's very hard to draw the line between a process that is as if random and one that is insufficiently random to be described in that way. And we can come back in the discussion afterwards, perhaps, to thinking more about why this as if randomization criterion is not a useful one. But broadly, what we're doing in the guidance is going with a much broader definition and saying what makes a good natural experimental study is the precise way in which the methods are applied in the context of that study, not whether you're using a method under one particular label or another. So that's what we want to say about concepts and definitions. One of the things that is kind of missing in a lot of the existing guidance is this question of how you discover your natural experiment in the first place. The guidance focuses on the methods, not really the starting point. How do you identify the opportunity for a good natural experiment evaluation? But if you look at the literature, the natural experimental literature, then what you see is that a similar kinds of circumstances recurring again and again. The same kinds of processes appear repeatedly in the natural experimental literature as the basis for natural experimental evaluation. So we've identified 5 of these that we want to suggest that people use as a starting point for thinking about opportunities for natural experimental studies. And they're listed on this slide. And I know that you'll be getting the copies of the slides afterwards, but So I won't need to go through these in any detail. But the point is that, natural experiments don't appear out of the blue. They tend to occur in certain kinds of situation and not others. And knowing where those opportunities occur is quite useful. One of the possible sets of circumstances that's missing from this list that might be surprising is really natural experiments, volcanoes and earthquakes and so on, which can, disrupt delivery of services and so on in a way that might give you an opportunity for an actual experiment. The reason why it's not on the list is that, the effects of those kinds of events tend to be unspecific. They might close down transport systems, but close down schools as well. So, which of those exposures as a result of your natural event is actually causing the change in outcomes that you're interested in looking at. So, unless the natural event has some specific effect on taking out a very particular, range of services or programs or whatever, they're not necessarily going to be particularly useful. And you have to look in much more detail at what's actually happening. So again, happy to expand on these a bit in the in questions afterwards. But the general idea is that that there is this range of different scenarios in which you might have an opportunity for an actual experimental study occurring, and it's useful to focus on them when you're thinking about setting up a study. So again, as I've said, existing guidance tends to focus on the methods, but there's a lot more to the design of a good study than just choosing a particular method of effect estimation. So one of the things we want to do in the guidance is to emphasize these other elements of study design and planning that you need to do well if you're going to have a good study as a result. I've already spoken about the discovery of the opportunity for an actual experiment in the first place, but it's important to think about feasibility as well, availability of data, how you're going to develop a good understanding of the assignment process and so forth as well, before you go on to thinking about the precise evaluation methods. So we set out this kind of planning framework, which is heavily influenced by the recent MRC guidance on the evaluation of complex interventions. Evaluation of natural experiments has a great deal in common with the evaluation of complex interventions generally. So we're drawing on aspects of that complex interventions framework here. So I'm rushing a bit now. Getting on to good practice consideration. So this is really how we are going to accumulate or pull together the main messages from the guidance. And as I said earlier, we're keen not just to speak to researchers and the research community narrowly defined. We also want to address our recommendations to users and funders of research evidence, right the way through from people like the MRC and NHR who support the work that we do, right the way through to the journal editors, users of evidence in government departments and other decision makers. So we'll be dividing our good practice recommendations into series of recommendations that apply to everybody, all producers and users of natural experiments, researchers, obviously, who actually do the work, either in the academic community or in other elements of the public service, government departments, local authorities, health boards, and so on. Research funders and commissioners, they've got a very important role in encouraging best practice generally, as well as supporting particular studies, so important messages for them. And then we've got a bunch of recommendations for journal editors, policymakers, decision makers as well. So that's how we'll be structuring our recommendations. So just to finish up, I hope it's reasonably clear from what I've already been saying that we think that evaluation methods shouldn't be seen in the terms of the traditional hierarchy. We're very often encouraged to think of randomized controlled trials as a kind of gold standard for evaluation. That's all very well if you have the opportunity to do a randomized controlled trial. Very often you don't. So it's rather empty to say that randomized controlled trials are the gold standard. And it's better, we think, to consider all of the evaluation methods that you've got available as a toolkit that you can apply in a flexible way to the evaluation problems that are interesting in their own right. And just as we shouldn't make a distinction between trials on the one hand as being the gold standard and everything else on the other, nor shall we elevate certain natural experimental methods to being the best in all circumstances. The key to designing a good study is to choosing the methods that will work in the precise circumstances of the natural experiment you're dealing with. And I'm done.
Look at that, perfect on timing. Just as the time was up, counter was there. Peter stopped. So thank you very much, Peter. And thank you for a fascinating overview of something that's quite that's happening right now and gives us a real insight into how it's going to be evolving and how it might affect your practice. So we're going to just send you away again for 5-6 minutes into breakout groups. Again, just to think about your reactions to that. Was this new to you? What are you fascinated about? How this might change your practice? And so that you can persuade one of your friends to ask the most tricky question for Peter in our follow-up question round. So Jonathan is going to send you off into breakout rooms now, and then we'll see you again shortly.